Emily Johnson believed her first job interview would change her life. Fresh out of college, she quietly straightened a crooked sign outside a major firm while others ignored it. The interviews were suddenly canceled, except for hers. Hired on the spot, she trusted her powerful supervisor, unaware she was being used in a financial scheme. When thousands of dollars appeared under her name, she was blamed and left standing alone in court. But truth has a way of rising. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. A thin March wind moved through Manhattan like a restless whisper, tugging at coats and carrying the sharp scent of rain that had fallen before dawn. The sky above New York City was pale and undecided, streaked with silver clouds reflecting off the mirrored surface of Harrington and Company's glass headquarters. Yellow taxis rolled past in steady rhythm, and the city felt awake, alert, and indifferent all at once. Emily Johnson stood at the end of a long line stretching along the sidewalk in front of the building. She was 22 years old, recently graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in accounting. Tall and slender, with smooth, deep brown skin and thoughtful almond-shaped eyes, Emily carried herself with quiet composure. Her natural black hair was pulled neatly into a low bun, not because it was fashionable, but because it was practical. She wore a navy blazer she had purchased second-hand, carefully pressed the night before, and modest black heels that pinched slightly but made her feel professional. Emily was not loud. She was not flashy. She had grown up in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago with her mother, Denise Johnson, a nursing assistant who worked double shifts and raised her daughter on discipline, prayer, and stubborn optimism. Years of watching her mother endure exhaustion without complaint had shaped Emily into someone who believed that perseverance was a form of dignity. The line ahead of her buzzed with nervous conversation. Young professionals checked their phones, rehearsed elevator pitches, adjusted ties. One of them, Jason Miller, stood about 6 people ahead. Jason was 24, broad-shouldered with sandy blonde hair styled carefully back and a square jaw that he carried with casual confidence. He wore an expensive charcoal suit tailored to fit his athletic build. Jason came from a comfortable suburb in Connecticut. His father owned a mid-sized accounting firm, and expectations had always surrounded him like invisible armor. He was friendly on the surface, quick with a joke, but underneath carried a competitive edge sharpened by years of being told he was meant to win. "Man, this place looks intense," he muttered to another candidate, glancing up at the towering glass facade. "But hey, only one of us walks out with the offer." The other candidate laughed nervously. Near the building's revolving doors stood a security guard named Harold Green. Harold was in his late 50s with a stocky build and graying mustache. His uniform fit tightly around his midsection, and his calm eyes suggested someone who had seen decades of human ambition pass through those doors. He greeted applicants with polite nods, but spoke little. Rain had left the pavement damp, and he occasionally shifted his weight to stay warm. Right before the entrance, a freestanding sign read, "Interview Registration Arrow." But the arrow was turned awkwardly toward the left, pointing at a side corridor that led nowhere. Applicants hesitated, some stepping toward the wrong door before circling back in confusion. A few frowned. One shook his head. No one touched the sign. Emily noticed it almost immediately. She watched 3 candidates veer off in the wrong direction and return, flustered. For a moment, she hesitated. It wasn't her responsibility. The wind nudged the sign slightly again, turning it even more crooked. Emily exhaled, stepped out of line, and walked toward it. Her heels clicked softly against the wet concrete. Without making a scene, she straightened the metal stand and rotated the arrow so it clearly pointed toward the registration desk inside the main lobby. "Thanks," Harold the security guard said quietly, giving her a small nod. She offered a modest smile and returned to her place in line. 6 floors above, in a corner office overlooking the street, Margaret Whitmore watched the scene unfold on a wall of security monitors. Margaret was 58 years old, tall, with a straight, commanding posture. Her silver-streaked blonde hair was styled in a precise bob that framed a sharp, angular face. Her blue-gray eyes were steady and analytical, missing very little. She wore a tailored ivory blazer over a silk blouse and minimal jewelry. A woman who valued order, discipline, and control. Margaret had built her career over 30 years in corporate finance. She was respected, even feared, known for her ability to detect financial inconsistencies within minutes. Colleagues described her as brilliant but distant. Some whispered that early in her career she had been underestimated in a male-dominated field, and that experience had hardened her. Whether that was true or not, Margaret did not tolerate incompetence. Beside her stood Claire Thompson, a mid-level accountant in her early 30s. Claire was average height with a slim build and shoulder-length chestnut hair usually tucked behind one ear. Her hazel eyes carried a quiet attentiveness. She dressed conservatively, gray slacks, soft blouses, and moved with careful professionalism. Unlike Margaret, Claire's demeanor was warm and approachable. She had grown up in Ohio in a working-class household and worked her way through college. She believed in fairness, perhaps more than was safe in corporate environments. Margaret pointed at the screen. "Rewind that," she instructed calmly. Claire complied. They watched Emily step forward again, straighten the sign, and return to line without speaking to anyone. Margaret's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Interesting," she murmured. Down on the sidewalk, Jason noticed Emily returning to her spot. "You volunteering for maintenance too?" he joked lightly. Emily blinked, slightly embarrassed. "It was just pointing the wrong way." Jason shrugged. "Not our job." Emily said nothing. At precisely 9 o'clock, Harold's radio crackled. He listened, frowned, then stepped forward. "Attention, everyone," he announced. "Due to internal circumstances, today's interviews have been canceled. You will receive further communication by email." The reaction was immediate. "What? You're kidding. I flew in for this. This is ridiculous." Jason's jaw tightened. "This has to be a mistake." People muttered angrily. Some checked their inboxes already. Others stormed off, heels striking pavement with frustration. Emily stood still, confusion settling slowly in her chest. Had she done something wrong? Before she could turn away, Harold approached her specifically. "Miss Johnson?" he asked carefully, glancing at a small tablet in his hand. Her heart skipped. "Yes?" "Would you come with me, please?" Jason's eyes narrowed as he watched her step forward. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors reflected soft lighting. The chaos of the street disappeared behind glass walls. Harold led Emily to a private elevator. She swallowed. "Is something wrong?" He gave a neutral expression. "I'm just following instructions." The elevator rose smoothly to the executive floor. Margaret Whitmore waited in a conference room lined with minimalist decor and floor-to-ceiling windows. Emily stepped inside, hands clasped lightly in front of her. Margaret studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "You straightened the sign," Margaret began. Emily nodded cautiously. It was confusing people. "And you didn't say anything. You didn't look around to see if someone else would do it." Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. It just seemed like the right thing. Claire stood slightly behind Margaret, observing silently. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Miss Johnson, we don't hire accountants based solely on GPA. We hire for judgment, initiative, integrity." Emily's pulse pounded. "The interviews today were an assessment," Margaret continued evenly. Most candidates demonstrated impatience or entitlement. You demonstrated responsibility." The room felt suddenly smaller. Margaret slid a folder across the table. "Position: Junior Accountant. Start date: tomorrow morning, 9 a.m." Emily stared at the folder as if it might disappear. "Tomorrow?" she whispered. Margaret's gaze remained steady. "Unless you prefer we reschedule." "No," Emily answered quickly. Thank you. Yes, I'll be here." Claire offered her a faint, reassuring smile. Outside the building, Jason watched through the glass as Emily emerged nearly 20 minutes later, clutching a folder. He stepped toward her. "What happened?" She hesitated. "They offered me the position." Silence fell between them. Jason forced a thin smile. "Guess straightening signs pays off." But his eyes told a different story. As Emily walked away down the sidewalk, the wind caught her blazer lightly. The city felt different now, brighter, louder, full of possibility. Above her, Margaret watched through the window, expression unreadable. The crooked sign below stood perfectly aligned. And something had just begun. Emily arrived the next morning, 10 minutes early, the Manhattan air still cool but brighter than the day before. The glass tower of Harrington & Co. reflected a clearer sky, as if the city itself had decided to cooperate with her new beginning. She stood for a moment across the street, steadying her breath, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her navy blazer. Today, she was no longer an applicant. Today, she belonged inside. The lobby felt different when she walked through it, with an employee badge clipped to her jacket. The marble floors gleamed, and the soft hum of business had replaced yesterday's nervous chatter. Harold Green, the security guard, offered her a subtle nod of recognition. It was small, but it grounded her. Upstairs, Margaret Whitmore was already at her desk. Margaret's office was immaculate. Documents aligned precisely, pens parallel, not a paper out of place. She did not look up immediately when Emily entered. "You're on time," Margaret said finally, glancing at her watch. "That's expected." "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied. Margaret studied her again as though measuring her resolve under fluorescent light. "You will be assisting me directly. That means precision, confidentiality, and efficiency. If you make an error, it will not be small." Emily nodded. There was no warmth in Margaret's tone, but there was clarity. Claire Thompson knocked lightly and stepped inside carrying a thin folder. Claire's expression was professional but curious. She offered Emily a gentle smile that contrasted Margaret's stern demeanor. "This is the internal access documentation," Claire explained. "You'll receive a limited authorization account. It allows you to process minor balance adjustments and reconciliation entries under supervision." Margaret added, "It is not a privilege, it is a tool. Tools are dangerous in untrained hands." Emily swallowed and signed the documents. Her workstation was placed just outside Margaret's office, positioned deliberately within sightline of the glass walls. The desk was modest but organized. A dual-monitor setup displayed the firm's internal accounting software, dense grids of numbers and transaction codes. Margaret began training immediately. She stood behind Emily, tall and rigid, her voice precise as a metronome. "Every number has a trail. You must understand not only what you enter, but why." Hours passed in concentrated silence. Emily's fingers moved cautiously across the keyboard. She double-checked every decimal, every code. Margaret corrected her posture once. "Sit straighter. Confidence affects perception." By midday, Emily's mind buzzed with information. She had learned to reconcile small discrepancies between departmental accounts, minor adjustments rarely exceeding a few $100s. Nothing dramatic, just housekeeping work that kept the financial machine smooth. Margaret watched carefully. "You learn quickly," she said without praise, simply as observation. "Thank you." Claire stopped by occasionally with documents to process. She noticed how closely Margaret monitored Emily. It wasn't unusual for a chief accountant to supervise a junior hire, but something about the intensity felt deliberate. Later that afternoon, Margaret handed Emily a slip of paper. "Process this adjustment under your credentials." Emily glanced at it. It says temporary zero balance transfer. Yes, it clears itself within 24 hours. Routine. Emily entered the data, careful as ever. The system accepted it without warning. Across the office floor, a new voice chimed in. Looks like the prodigy's already working miracles. The speaker was Daniel Reeves, a senior analyst in his early 40s. Daniel was tall, slightly stooped from years at a desk with thinning dark hair and rectangular glasses that magnified observant brown eyes. He had a dry sense of humor and a reputation for staying neutral in office politics. Divorced, father of one teenage daughter, Daniel carried a quiet fatigue that came from balancing career and custody schedules. Emily offered a polite smile. Just learning. Learning fast, he replied, glancing toward Margaret's closed office door. By the end of her first week, Emily felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Margaret corrected her mistakes swiftly, but explained the logic behind every process. She demanded accuracy, but rewarded improvement with incremental responsibility. At home that Friday evening, Emily sat at the small desk in her modest Brooklyn apartment. The room was narrow but tidy, decorated with framed photos of her and her mother. She opened her laptop and transferred a portion of her first paycheck to Denise Johnson in Atlanta. Denise was 50, petite, with warm brown skin and tired but resilient eyes. Years of working hospital night shifts had left faint lines around her mouth. She had raised Emily alone after her husband passed away from a sudden heart attack when Emily was 12. Loss had shaped Denise into someone fiercely protective, yet encouraging of independence. When her phone rang, Denise answered on the second ring. "Baby? I sent you something," Emily said softly. There was a pause. "Emily, you don't have to. I want to." Denise's voice thickened slightly. "I'm proud of you. You remember that." Emily closed her eyes, holding on to those words longer than she admitted. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens, Jason Miller sat at his kitchen counter, scrolling through social media. The light from his phone reflected off his sharp features. His pride had not recovered from that morning outside Harrington and Company. He typed slowly, "Funny how some companies prioritize optics over merit these days. Guess straightening a sign counts as experience." He did not mention Emily by name, but the implication lingered. A few former applicants liked the post. One commented, "Corporate image matters more than qualifications." Jason leaned back, satisfied with the subtlety. He told himself it wasn't jealousy, it was fairness. Back at the office the following Monday, Claire observed another moment that unsettled her. Margaret approached Emily's desk holding a file marked, "Adjustment, Special." Her expression was composed. "Process this under your account," Margaret instructed. Emily hesitated briefly. "Is this similar to Friday's transfer?" "Yes, temporary reconciliation between departments." The amount was slightly higher this time, still within junior clearance but close to the upper limit. Claire watched from her desk across the floor. She had worked under Margaret for 6 years. She knew Margaret valued control. But why delegate these particular adjustments repeatedly to the newest hire? Claire wasn't suspicious yet, just attentive. During lunch, Claire joined Emily in the break room. The space smelled faintly of reheated pasta and coffee. Claire poured tea into a ceramic mug chipped at the rim. "How's your first week, really?" Claire asked gently. Emily smiled. "Intense, but good. Ms. Whitmore expects a lot." "She always has," Claire replied. "Just make sure you understand every instruction. Ask questions." "I do." Claire nodded, studying her face. Emily's sincerity was unmistakable. Margaret, in her office, reviewed transaction logs on her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before making a subtle adjustment to access permissions. Her face revealed nothing. To her, this was strategy, not malice. She believed in calculated moves. She had built her empire that way. By the end of the second week, Emily had processed multiple temporary adjustments. Each one appeared clean within the system. No alerts, no flags. She assumed this was simply part of learning complex corporate accounting structures. Daniel Reeves passed her desk again one afternoon. "You're becoming the boss's favorite," he remarked lightly. Emily shook her head. "I'm just trying not to mess up." "Careful," Daniel said with a half-smile. "Favorites carry weight." She didn't fully understand what he meant. That evening, rain returned to the city, streaking down the windows of the executive floor. Margaret stood alone, watching traffic blur below. Claire remained at her desk, reviewing quarterly reports. She glanced once more at the pattern of adjustments Emily had processed. A pattern wasn't proof, but it was something. Emily shut down her computer and slipped her badge into her bag. As she left, she felt a quiet certainty growing inside her. This was her breakthrough, the opportunity she had prayed for, the start of a career that would lift her mother out of long hospital shifts and into retirement. Outside, the city lights reflected off rain-soaked pavement. Emily stepped into the night with cautious hope, unaware of how carefully every keystroke had been placed under her name. And high above the street, behind glass and silence, Margaret Whitmore closed her office door. The golden opportunity had been given. By early April, the rhythm inside Harrington and Company had settled into something that felt predictable. Morning light filtered through the tall glass windows, reflecting off polished desks and muted gray carpets. The city outside moved with relentless ambition. But inside the accounting floor, everything operated in controlled precision. Numbers, approvals, digital trails. Emily Johnson had begun to feel less like a visitor and more like a part of the machinery. She arrived each morning with quiet focus, her navy blazer replaced occasionally by soft, neutral sweaters, her hair still secured in a neat, low bun. There was something steady about her presence, an attentiveness that made colleagues comfortable trusting her with details. Margaret Whitmore noticed that steadiness too. One Tuesday morning, Margaret stepped out of her office holding a slim leather folder. Her posture remained rigid, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Emily," she called calmly. Emily turned immediately. "Yes, ma'am." "I need another temporary adjustment processed under your credentials. Departmental reconciliation." The tone was the same as before, clinical, unemotional, but the amount was larger than usual. Emily glanced at the figure briefly. It exceeded previous entries by several $1,000s. She hesitated, only for a second. "Is this still zero balance?" she asked carefully. Margaret's eyes remained steady. "It clears within the internal cycle. You're learning to trust the system." Emily nodded and began typing. The accounting software did not protest. The transaction posted smoothly. A secondary internal account, registered under a subledger profile with Emily's authorization, received the transfer temporarily. According to the dashboard, it would balance out by morning. It did not. The next day, another instruction arrived. Then another, each labeled temporary, each passing through Emily's credentials before being redirected elsewhere. What Emily could not see was the secondary pathway. Margaret, late at night after most employees had left, accessed administrative overrides through a master console only she controlled. The money that briefly appeared under Emily's limited account was rerouted again, split into fragmented transfers that left the firm's visible structure and traveled outward through layered accounts. To Margaret, it was not recklessness. It was design. Margaret had always believed in preparation. In her early 30s, she had once been blamed for a financial discrepancy she did not create, an internal investigation that nearly ended her career. Though she was cleared, the humiliation had reshaped her. She learned then that survival in corporate finance meant never standing unprotected. Documentation mattered. Positioning mattered more. And now, she was positioning. Across the office, Claire Thompson watched patterns quietly emerge. Claire had always possessed a meticulous mind. As a child growing up in Dayton, Ohio, she had been the type to organize her school notebooks by color and rewrite homework if it smudged. Her father, a factory worker laid off during a recession, had taught her that financial instability could change a family overnight. That memory never left her. One afternoon, while reconciling quarterly reports, Claire noticed a cluster of adjustments originating from Emily's account. Individually, none were alarming. Together, they formed a rhythm, repeating intervals, increasing amounts. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. "Strange," she murmured. Daniel Reeves, seated a few desks away, glanced up from his monitor. "What is?" "Nothing yet," Claire replied carefully. Meanwhile, outside of work, Emily's evenings had grown busier. 3 nights a week, she traveled to Midtown for an advanced certification course in forensic accounting. The classroom was modest. Fluorescent lights, whiteboard stained faintly with old marker lines, folding desks arranged in rows. The instructor, Professor Leonard Harris, was a lean man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes that softened when discussing ethics. He had spent decades as a federal financial investigator before retiring to teach. His voice carried authority without arrogance. "Numbers don't lie," he often said, "but people can make them look like they do." Emily took notes diligently, her handwriting precise. She admired Professor Harris's emphasis on accountability. She imagined one day specializing in compliance auditing, helping companies prevent fraud rather than becoming part of it. After class, she sometimes walked to the subway with a fellow student named Maya Patel. Maya was 25. Petite with long dark hair usually tied in a loose braid. She wore oversized glasses and spoke quickly when excited. Raised by immigrant parents who owned a small grocery store in Queens, Maya valued education fiercely. "You're already working at Harrington?" Maya asked one evening, impressed. "Yes, junior accountant." "That's huge." Emily smiled shyly. "I just want to do well." Back at Harrington and Company, Margaret's lifestyle had begun to shift in subtle but visible ways. Claire first noticed it during a Friday afternoon meeting. Margaret arrived carrying a structured black Chanel handbag, sleek, unmistakably expensive. The following week, it was a deep burgundy Hermes tote, then a pair of designer heels that gleamed against the office's neutral tones. Margaret had always dressed elegantly, but never extravagantly. Claire mentioned it lightly to Daniel over coffee. "Have you noticed Ms. Whitmore's new accessories?" Daniel shrugged. "She's been here 30 years. Maybe she's rewarding herself." "Maybe," Claire said, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. Late one evening, Emily stayed past 6 to complete a set of reconciliations. The office floor was nearly empty. The overhead lights dimmed slightly in energy-saving mode. Margaret stepped out of her office quietly. "You're dedicated," she observed. "I want to be thorough," Emily replied. Margaret placed a hand briefly on the back of Emily's chair, a gesture that felt almost maternal. "Ambition must be paired with discretion. Remember that." Emily nodded, unaware of the double meaning. Over the next 2 weeks, the sums increased again. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000. Each routed temporarily through Emily's limited access account, each vanishing after administrative intervention. From the system's visible logs, it appeared that Emily had authorized and processed all entries. In reality, she was executing instructions. But legal systems did not always distinguish between instruction and intent. Claire's discomfort deepened when she accessed expense summaries during a routine internal review. Margaret's personal expense reimbursements remained modest. No irregularities there. The missing money was not leaving through official channels. That realization chilled her. One afternoon, while printing reports, Claire noticed Emily smiling faintly at her phone. "Good news?" Claire asked. "My mom," Emily replied. "She used the money I sent to fix the heater in her apartment." Claire felt a pang of something, admiration, maybe guilt. Emily was so unaware of the storm forming quietly around her. Later that week, Professor Harris assigned a case study in class involving internal fraud disguised as temporary ledger transfers. Emily read the scenario carefully. Temporary balance adjustments, administrative overrides, secondary routing. She frowned slightly at the coincidence, but dismissed it. Corporate accounting was complex. Overlapping processes were normal. She did not see the pattern in her own work yet. Back at Harrington and Company, Margaret finalized another series of late-night entries. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, sharp, composed, calculating. Always have a buffer, she whispered to herself. The buffer was Emily's name. By the end of the month, the cumulative amount that had passed through Emily's internal account exceeded $70,000 in fragmented transactions. None remained there long. Each transfer dissolved before morning. If anyone investigated surface logs, the origin would trace to the junior accountant's credentials. Emily continued attending her night classes, studying audit trails and legal accountability with growing passion. She believed knowledge would protect her future. She did not yet understand that her present was being rewritten line by line. One Friday evening, as rain once again tapped softly against the office windows, Claire stared at her monitor. The numbers aligned too perfectly to ignore. She didn't accuse, she didn't confront. But she began saving copies. And across the floor, Emily shut down her computer, unaware that the invisible trap had already tightened quietly around her. The shift began on an ordinary Monday morning. The sky above Manhattan was overcast, low gray clouds pressing down against the mirrored surface of Harrington and Company. The city moved as always, taxis honking, delivery trucks unloading, professionals crossing streets with coffee in hand. Inside the building, however, there was a tension that felt almost electrical. Emily sensed it before anyone said a word. She had arrived early, reviewing reconciliation summaries from the previous week. Her desk was organized as usual, her posture straight, her expression focused. But as she logged into the system, a red notification banner flashed briefly across her dashboard before disappearing. System audit protocol initiated. She frowned slightly. Internal audits were normal. She had learned that in class. Still, the timing unsettled her. Across the floor, Claire Thompson was unusually quiet. She sat at her desk, her hazel eyes scanning a printed report more slowly than usual. Claire had slept poorly. The pattern she had been tracking, the cluster of temporary transfers, had not faded. Instead, it had crystallized. At precisely 10:15 a.m., a new presence stepped onto the accounting floor. Victor Langley, head of internal compliance. Victor was in his late 40s, tall and lean with sharply defined cheekbones and close-cropped dark hair flecked with gray at the temples. His suit was always impeccably tailored in conservative navy or charcoal. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried controlled authority. Years earlier, he had led a major fraud investigation in another firm that resulted in multiple convictions. Since then, he had been brought into Harrington and Company specifically to prevent reputational damage. Victor rarely appeared without purpose. Margaret Whitmore stepped out of her office to greet him. Her expression remained neutral, but her shoulders were slightly tighter than usual. "Victor," she said smoothly, "I wasn't informed of an on-site review." "It's routine," Victor replied, his tone flat. "Triggered by transactional irregularities." Claire felt her stomach tighten. Within the hour, several employees were called into a glass-walled conference room. The transparency of the room only intensified the tension. Everyone outside could see silhouettes moving, though not hear the words exchanged. At 11:05 a.m., Harold Green appeared at Emily's desk. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "they're asking for you upstairs." Emily blinked. "Me?" "Yes." Her heart began to pound, though she didn't know why. She smoothed her skirt and walked toward the conference room. Colleagues avoided her eyes. Daniel Reeves gave her a brief look of concern but said nothing. Inside the room sat Victor Langley at the head of the table. Margaret Whitmore sat to his right, hands folded calmly. Two other figures were present. The first was Angela Brooks, the company's legal counsel, a woman in her early 40s with sleek black hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp dark eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Angela was known for her precision in language and her unwillingness to tolerate ambiguity. The second was Thomas Reed, a senior IT auditor with pale skin and narrow shoulders, his fingers constantly adjusting his wireframe glasses. He rarely looked directly at people, preferring screens to faces. Emily took a seat, confusion beginning to edge into fear. Victor placed a folder on the table. "Miss Johnson," he began evenly, "are you aware of the total value of temporary adjustments processed under your credentials over the last 6 weeks?" Emily swallowed. "No, sir. I processed what I was assigned." Angela slid a document toward her. $73,000. The number seemed detached from reality, floating on the page like a foreign object. "That can't be right," Emily whispered. Thomas cleared his throat. "All transactions originate from your user ID, time-stamped, authorized." Emily's breathing quickened. "I processed adjustments, temporary ones. They cleared." Margaret's voice entered softly, almost regretful. "Emily, I instructed you to understand every transaction you handled." The subtle shift in tone cut deeper than accusation. "I did what you asked me to," Emily said, her voice shaking now. Victor's expression did not change. "The funds were transferred into a subledger associated with your access privileges and subsequently routed externally." "Externally?" Emily repeated faintly. "To accounts not registered within company control." Silence pressed against her ears. The room felt smaller, air thinner. "I didn't take anything," she said, her words barely audible. Angela closed the folder gently. "Intent will be determined during the formal review." Emily's vision blurred. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright. $73,000. Her mind searched desperately for explanation, but numbers tangled into confusion. "I don't even have that kind of money," she murmured. Margaret's gaze remained unreadable. Victor stood. "You are suspended effective immediately pending investigation." The finality in his tone shattered something inside her. The next sensation was weightlessness. The room tilted. Voices muffled, and then darkness swallowed everything. When Emily collapsed, it was Claire who rushed forward first. "Call medical!" Claire shouted. Harold reappeared instantly, kneeling beside Emily's motionless form. His weathered hands were steady, but his face tightened with concern. The office floor buzzed with whispers within minutes. "She fainted. 73,000. Unbelievable." An ambulance was not called. Emily regained consciousness within minutes, disoriented but stable. She was escorted from the building quietly, badge confiscated. By late afternoon, Harrington and Company released an internal memo confirming that an employee was under investigation for financial misconduct. The name was not included, but by evening it did not matter. Jason Miller sat in his Queens apartment again, scrolling through a local business news site. A headline had already surfaced. "Young junior accountant under investigation at major financial firm." Jason's lips curled slightly. He opened his social media app and typed, "Funny how fast integrity collapses. Guess signs aren't the only thing that gets straightened." This time the tone was less subtle. Comments followed quickly. "Told you. Didn't see that coming." He leaned back, satisfied that the narrative now aligned with his resentment. Back at Harrington and Company. Employees gathered in small clusters near the coffee station. "Just needed a name," someone muttered. 73,000? That's bold." Another voice whispered, quieter but cutting, They won't go after someone higher up. Easier this way. Claire stood nearby, hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't sipped. Her pulse raced. She replayed every transaction she had observed, every designer handbag, every late-night entry. Margaret exited her office carrying her structured black Chanel bag, expression composed. If there was anxiety beneath her surface, it did not show. "Compliance will handle it," she said calmly to a small group within earshot. "Let this be a lesson about oversight." Claire felt something shift inside her, not certainty yet, but conviction forming in fragments. That night, Emily lay awake in her Brooklyn apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, news alerts, messages from classmates, missed calls from her mother. She did not answer. Her world, built carefully over months of discipline and hope, had cracked in a single afternoon. The following morning, legal paperwork was filed formally. Harrington and Company initiated civil action to recover lost funds and protect its reputation. By noon, major outlets carried a headline more direct than the first. "Young accountant accused of embezzlement." Her photo, taken from her company ID, accompanied the article. In the office break room, someone whispered again, almost casually, all they needed was a name. Claire stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She had no proof, but she no longer believed what everyone else seemed willing to accept. And somewhere inside the polished towers of Harrington and Company, and the fall was complete. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Morning light filtered through tall rectangular windows, casting pale beams across rows of benches already half filled with observers. Outside, Manhattan moved with its usual indifference, but inside courtroom 11B, everything felt suspended in gravity. Emily Johnson sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple charcoal suit borrowed from a former classmate. Her hair pulled back into the same careful bun she had worn on her first day at Harrington and Company. Her face looked thinner now, shadows resting beneath her eyes from sleepless nights. She tried to hold her posture straight, but the weight pressing on her shoulders was heavier than fabric could carry. At the front of the room sat Judge Robert Klein. Judge Klein was 62, tall and broad-shouldered even in his seated position. His silver hair was combed straight back, revealing a high forehead lined with age and experience. His blue-gray eyes were sharp, not unkind but disciplined. He had built his reputation over decades as a judge who valued procedure above emotion. Early in his legal career, he had once dismissed a case too quickly and later learned that evidence had been overlooked. The mistake had hardened him. Since then, he tolerated no ambiguity. To Emily's right sat her court-appointed defense attorney, Michael Grant, a lean man in his late 30s with dark hair parted neatly and a nervous habit of adjusting his tie. Michael had handled mostly minor financial disputes before this case. He was competent, but clearly aware that this courtroom felt larger than his usual terrain. Across from them, representing Harrington and Company, was Angela Brooks. Her black hair remained perfectly secured in a tight bun, her posture unwavering. She spoke with calm precision, each sentence measured and deliberate. To her, this was not personal. It was corporate protection. "The evidence," Angela stated firmly, gesturing toward a digital display, "demonstrates that $73,000 were processed and authorized under Miss Johnson's credentials. The digital trail is clear." Judge Klein leaned slightly forward. "Miss Johnson, do you dispute that these transactions were made under your login?" Emily's voice trembled, but did not break. "I processed temporary adjustments I was instructed to handle. I did not transfer money outside the company." Angela's expression remained neutral. "Intent does not erase authorization." Each word felt like a hammer striking polished stone. In the gallery, a few former applicants, including Jason Miller, sat quietly. Jason wore a dark jacket, arms crossed. His expression carried a mixture of curiosity and something more subtle, vindication. During a recess, he leaned toward a friend. Told you it was too good to be true. Back inside the corporate tower of Harrington and Cotter, Claire Thompson sat alone at her desk. The office atmosphere had shifted since Emily's suspension. Conversations were quieter. Eyes avoided contact more often. Claire's hazel eyes stared at her monitor, but she wasn't reading the spreadsheet displayed there. Instead, she replayed weeks of observations in her mind. The sequence of adjustments, the designer handbags, the late-night administrative overrides. Margaret Whitmore moved through the office as always, precise, controlled, composed. If the court proceedings unsettled her, she did not show it. She carried a structured Hermes bag that morning, deep navy leather with subtle gold hardware. Claire felt the gap between appearance and possibility widen. At lunchtime, Claire stepped outside into the mild spring air. She dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Daniel Park answered on the third ring. Daniel Park was 34, Korean-American, lean with sharp features and observant dark eyes. He wore his black hair neatly parted and preferred understated clothing, usually dark button-down shirts and slim trousers. In college, Daniel had been known for his brilliance in computer science and his stubborn moral code. After graduation, he had built a reputation in cybersecurity, specializing in digital forensics. He understood how systems could be manipulated and how they could expose truth. "Claire?" he said, surprised. "It's been a while." "I need your help," she replied quietly. They met that evening at a small cafe in Midtown. The space was narrow, with exposed brick walls and low-hanging Edison bulbs casting warm light over mismatched wooden tables. Claire explained everything: the transactions, the patterns, the trial. Daniel listened without interruption, fingers wrapped around a cup of black coffee. His expression tightened gradually. "You're asking me to access a corporate executive's computer without authorization," he said carefully. "I'm asking you to tell me if I'm wrong," Claire replied. "If there's something hidden." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Claire, this crosses lines. If I'm caught, it's not just a reprimand. It's federal charges." "I know." He studied her face. Claire had always been steady, rational. If she was this unsettled, something deeper was at play. "You believe she's innocent," he said. "Yes?" Silence lingered between them. "I'll think about it," Daniel finally said. Back in the courtroom the next day, Angela presented additional system logs. Each timestamp pointed to Emily's credentials. Each line reinforced the narrative. Judge Klein's tone remained stern. "Miss Johnson, you are responsible for understanding the implications of actions taken under your authority." Emily's hands trembled slightly on the table. She wanted to say that she trusted instructions, that she believed mentorship meant protection, not betrayal. But the courtroom was not built for innocence. It was built for proof. That afternoon, Daniel called Claire. "1 hour," he said. "Tomorrow during her lunch break, that's all I can risk." Claire's pulse quickened. The following day, Margaret Whitmore left her office promptly at 12:15 p.m., as she often did, heading toward a nearby upscale restaurant. Her routine was consistent, predictable. Claire walked calmly into Margaret's office 15 minutes later, carrying a stack of printed reports as camouflage. Daniel entered moments after, dressed like a courier technician. Dark jacket, slim laptop bag slung over his shoulder. Margaret's office smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. The desk was immaculate, but Daniel's eyes moved quickly beyond surface order. He connected a discreet external drive to the desktop system. 50 minutes, he muttered. Claire stood near the door, heart pounding against her ribs. Daniel navigated through layers of encrypted directories. His fingers moved rapidly, confidence battling caution. "She's careful," he murmured. "Very careful." At minute 32, he paused. "There's a hidden partition." He bypassed one encryption layer, then another. Claire held her breath. A file directory appeared, buried beneath administrative archives. risk_transfer_log. Daniel read quietly. He opened it. Rows of entries filled the screen, dates, amounts, account redirections. $73,000 broken into fragments. Emily's account listed as buffer access. Beneath that, a column labeled liability shift. Claire's vision sharpened. There, Daniel said softly. She designed it. Another document opened. Notes outlining contingency plans in the event of internal audit detection. Phrases like junior access vulnerability and expendable authorization. Claire felt something inside her crack. She knew, Claire whispered. Daniel closed the files carefully, copying encrypted evidence onto his drive. His jaw tightened. I can't believe she documented it. She thought no one would look, Claire said. When Margaret returned at 1:20 p.m., her office appeared untouched. Daniel had already left. That evening in court, proceedings adjourned with no resolution. Judge Klein announced continuation the following week. Emily walked out of the courtroom feeling smaller than the building itself. Across the city, Claire sat at her kitchen table staring at the copied files stored securely on Daniel's encrypted device. She had proof now, but proof carried consequence. Reporting it meant accusing her superior. It meant risking her job, her stability, her future. Daniel called her late that night. If you submit this, there's no going back, he said quietly. Claire closed her eyes. Some things, she replied, are worth not going back from. The quiet investigation had uncovered what the courtroom could not yet see, and the truth now existed. Silent, but undeniable. The morning the court reconvened, the air over Manhattan felt unusually clear. Sunlight broke cleanly between the buildings, casting sharp lines across courthouse steps where reporters had already begun to gather. The atmosphere carried anticipation, not loud, but charged. Inside courtroom 11B, Emily Johnson sat once again at the defense table. She looked thinner than she had weeks earlier, yet something steadier lived behind her eyes now. Her charcoal suit was pressed carefully. Her hands were still folded in her lap, but no longer trembling. She did not yet know what Claire had decided. Across the aisle, Angela Brooks arranged her documents with calm precision. Her posture remained flawless, but there was a subtle crease between her brows this morning, a signal that something unexpected had entered her preparation. Judge Robert Klein entered promptly at 9. His black robe moved in controlled lines as he took his seat. His sharp blue-gray eyes scanned the room with practiced neutrality. Court is in session. At the back of the courtroom, Claire Thompson stood quietly near the wall. She wore a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry. Her chestnut hair was pulled back more tightly than usual, as if bracing herself. In her hands, she held a sealed envelope. Beside her stood Daniel Park. Daniel looked more serious than Claire had ever seen him. His usually composed expression carried tension beneath it. He wore a dark suit borrowed from a colleague, formal but understated. He understood the gravity of what he had helped uncover. Though brilliant in cybersecurity, he was not accustomed to courtrooms. Before proceedings began, Claire stepped forward. Your Honor, Michael Grant said, rising quickly from the defense table. His voice carried new firmness. The defense requests permission to submit newly discovered evidence relevant to the case. Angela's head turned sharply. Judge Klein adjusted his glasses. On what grounds? Digital forensic findings directly connected to the transaction history under dispute. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Klein extended his hand. Approach. Claire walked forward. For a brief moment, her eyes met Emily's. There was reassurance there, quiet but unmistakable. Michael received the envelope and handed it to the clerk. Judge Klein reviewed the contents slowly, expression unreadable. Angela Brooks stood. Your Honor, we were not informed of any such evidence. You are now, Judge Klein replied calmly. We will examine it. Daniel was called to the stand first. He adjusted the microphone slightly, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. His voice was clear. My name is Daniel Park. I am a cybersecurity specialist with 8 years of experience in digital forensic analysis. Angela approached for questioning. Mr. Park, were you authorized to access Harrington and Company, his internal systems? Daniel did not flinch. I was granted temporary physical access to a workstation used by a senior executive. The data extracted pertains directly to the transactions under investigation. Were you invited by the company? No. A slight stir filled the courtroom. Judge Klein leaned forward. Proceed. Daniel explained the hidden partition, the encrypted directory, and the file labeled risk_transfer_log. A large monitor displayed screenshots, transaction charts, internal notes, system timestamps. He pointed to specific entries. These logs indicate that while the visible authorizations originated from Miss Johnson's limited account, administrative overrides were executed under a master credential assigned exclusively to Chief Accountant Margaret Whitmore. Angela's composure tightened. Victor Langley, seated behind the company's table, shifted uncomfortably. Michael Grant rose next. Mr. Park, do these logs suggest that Miss Johnson had the authority to reroute funds externally? No, Daniel answered. Her access level permitted temporary adjustments only. The external transfers required administrative privileges. Judge Klein examined the display carefully. Call Margaret Whitmore to the stand. Margaret walked forward with measured steps. She wore a cream blazer and carried no handbag today. Her silver-streaked hair remained perfectly styled, but a faint tension lingered in her jaw. She took the oath and sat upright, hands folded. Angela began gently. Ms. Whitmore, are you aware of these files? Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the screen. I am aware of internal audit protocols. That was not the question. Margaret inhaled slowly. I am not aware of unauthorized access to my system. Michael stepped forward for cross-examination. Miss Whitmore, does your position grant you master administrative privileges? Yes. Are you the only individual with that specific override key? Yes. Michael clicked to enlarge a log entry. This timestamp, 11:47 p.m., April 12th. It shows administrative override routing funds after a temporary adjustment made earlier that day under Miss Johnson's credentials. Were you in the office that night? Margaret hesitated. I often work late. So that's a yes? Yes. And this entry, risk_transfer_log. What does junior access vulnerability mean? Margaret's composure cracked almost imperceptibly. That is taken out of context. Then provide context. Silence stretched. Judge Klein's voice cut through it. Answer the question. Margaret's fingers tightened. It refers to standard contingency planning. For what? Michael pressed. For potential audit flags, she replied sharply, and liability shift. Margaret's control faltered visibly now. A flush crept up her neck. That is hypothetical documentation. Michael stepped closer. Hypothetical documentation of transferring $73,000 through a junior employee's account? Margaret's voice rose. It was never meant to implicate her. The courtroom froze. Emily's breath caught. Judge Klein leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Clarify that statement. Margaret looked toward Angela, who remained silent. It was a structural oversight, Margaret said quickly. The system requires layered buffers. Buffers that assign liability to subordinates? Judge Klein asked coldly. Margaret's silence answered more loudly than words. Victor Langley shifted again in his seat, realization dawning visibly across his features. Michael turned toward the bench. Your Honor, the defense moves for dismissal based on demonstrable evidence that Miss Johnson lacked authority and control over the external transfers. She functioned solely as a processing intermediary. Judge Klein removed his glasses slowly, examining the room. In reviewing the submitted forensic evidence, he began carefully, "This court finds that the administrative overrides required to execute the external transfers were exclusively accessible to Ms. Whitmore." He looked directly at Emily. Miss Johnson's role was limited. The court recognizes her as an intermediary without independent control over the funds in question. Angela Brooks remained still, jaw tight. Judge Klein continued, voice firm and resonant. "The charges against Miss Emily Johnson are hereby dismissed. She is cleared of all allegations related to the $73,000 transfer." A collective breath released across the courtroom. Emily felt the words before she fully understood them. Cleared. Dismissed. Innocent. Her eyes filled with the tears she had fought for weeks. Margaret sat rigid, staring forward as if the air around her had hardened. In the gallery, several Harrington and Company employees lowered their heads. Daniel Reeves avoided eye contact with anyone. A young analyst whispered, "We should have questioned it." Claire closed her eyes briefly, relief washing through her in waves. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled as the announcement spread. Across town, Jason Miller sat at his kitchen counter, staring at his phone. The headline updated in real time. Charges dropped against junior accountant. Executive implicated. Jason's fingers hovered over his social media profile. Slowly, deliberately, he deleted the posts he had written weeks earlier. One by one, they disappeared. He leaned back in silence. Inside the courtroom, Judge Klein concluded, "This court stands adjourned." Emily remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the weight lifting from her chest. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Claire approached quietly. "It's over," she whispered. Emily looked at her, gratitude too large for words. The truth, once buried beneath careful design and polished authority, had surfaced. And the record now reflected it. The morning Emily returned to Harrington and Company, the city felt different. Late spring sunlight poured generously over Manhattan, warming the sidewalks and reflecting brightly against the glass facade of the tower that had once seemed so intimidating. The wind was softer now, carrying the distant hum of traffic and possibility rather than tension. Emily stood across the street for a moment, just as she had on her first day. She wore a light gray suit this time, new but simple. Her hair was still pulled into a neat low bun, though there was a quiet confidence in the way she held her shoulders now. The weeks in court had left their mark on her, but they had not broken her. If anything, her gaze was steadier, her posture more grounded. News of the court's ruling had spread quickly. Harrington and Company had no choice but to respond. 2 days after Judge Klein's dismissal of the charges, the company issued a formal public statement acknowledging procedural failures and expressing regret for the harm caused to Emily Johnson. It was carefully worded, drafted by a team of public relations consultants, but it contained what mattered most: an apology. Victor Langley, the head of compliance, stood behind a polished podium in the company's main conference room when the statement was read. His tall, lean frame appeared slightly more burdened than before. Though composed, there was humility in his voice. "We failed to ensure proper oversight," he said. "Miss Johnson was wrongfully implicated. Harrington and Company extends its sincere apology and offers full support for her continued professional development." Support meant more than words. Emily was invited back not as a junior assistant under scrutiny, but as a participant in a sponsored advanced training program in forensic accounting and compliance leadership. The company would fund her certification, tuition, and mentorship under a newly appointed supervisory structure. Margaret Whitmore did not attend the statement. She had been arrested quietly the evening after the court ruling. Federal investigators, alerted by the digital forensic evidence presented in court, moved swiftly. The charges extended beyond the initial $73,000. Further audits revealed additional irregularities in past fiscal cycles. When officers escorted her from her townhouse in Westchester County, she remained outwardly composed. Neighbors watched discreetly from behind curtains. The structured Chanel handbags and Hermes totes that once symbolized quiet power now sat motionless inside a silent house. In court filings released days later, it was confirmed that Margaret would be required to repay the misappropriated funds and face criminal penalties. Her reputation, built meticulously over decades, unraveled with unsettling speed. Back at Harrington and Company, changes followed. Claire Thompson sat in the same office where she had once hesitated to speak. Now she occupied Margaret's former glass-walled space. Temporarily at first, then permanently after the board's decision to promote her to acting director of financial oversight. Claire had not sought the title. In fact, when Victor first approached her, she had resisted. "I did what anyone should have done," she said. Victor had replied evenly, "Most people don't." Claire's promotion was not merely symbolic. It was recognition of integrity over hierarchy. She retained her modest manner, still tucking her chestnut hair behind her ear when thinking deeply, still pausing before making decisions. But there was strength in her now that had not been visible before, a certainty shaped by difficult choice. Daniel Park, too, found himself unexpectedly woven into the company's future. After internal review, Harrington and Company formally offered him a position as senior cybersecurity consultant. The board understood that their digital infrastructure required reinforcement, and Daniel's expertise, though initially disruptive, had proven invaluable. Daniel considered the offer carefully. He had always valued independence, but he also recognized the opportunity to build systems that prevented future abuse. When he accepted, it was with clear terms: transparency, oversight, accountability. On his first day walking through the Harrington lobby as an official employee, he carried himself with the same quiet precision that had defined him in the courtroom. His sharp, dark eyes scanned the environment not with suspicion, but with purpose. Emily's return to the office floor was quieter than the public statement had been. As she stepped through the revolving doors, Harold Green straightened from his post and offered a respectful nod. "Good to see you back, Miss Johnson." "Thank you," she replied softly. The elevator ride upward felt symbolic, a vertical return not only to her workplace but to her dignity. When the doors opened, conversations hushed briefly. A few employees avoided her gaze out of lingering embarrassment. Others offered tentative smiles. Daniel Reeves approached her desk first. "I should have questioned things sooner," he admitted, adjusting his glasses nervously. Emily studied him for a moment. "We all see clearly in hindsight." He nodded, grateful for the grace. Near the coffee station, two younger analysts lowered their heads as she passed. One murmured quietly, "I'm sorry." She did not demand apologies. She accepted them with simple acknowledgement. Jason Miller was not present. Word had circulated that he had withdrawn his application permanently after the trial concluded. His earlier social media posts had disappeared, erased as though they had never existed. Silence, in his case, had replaced commentary. Claire stepped out of her new office and met Emily halfway across the floor. "I'm glad you came back," Claire said. Emily smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure I would." Claire's hazel eyes softened. "This place needs to change, and it can't do that without people who believe in it." They stood for a moment, not as superior and subordinate, but as allies. Later that afternoon, Victor Langley met privately with Emily. His posture was still formal, but his tone carried sincerity. "The board approved your enrollment in the Advanced Compliance Fellowship Program," he said. "Full sponsorship. You will rotate through audit, risk management, and ethics review." Emily absorbed the words carefully. "You earned this," Victor added. She thought of the courtroom, the headlines, the long nights staring at her apartment ceiling. "I survived it," she replied quietly. Outside the building, mounted firmly near the entrance, stood the same metal sign that had once been crooked. Interview Registration Arrow. But now it was bolted securely to a fixed base, reinforced so that wind could not turn it. The arrow pointed straight and unwavering toward the correct entrance. As Emily left the building that evening, sunlight catching in her eyes, she paused beside it. She touched the edge lightly. That small act, turning a sign in the wind, had set everything in motion. It had revealed ambition, cruelty, courage, and truth. Claire exited moments later, locking the glass doors behind her. Daniel stood nearby reviewing architectural security plans on his tablet. The city buzzed around them, indifferent yet alive. Emily looked up at the building's reflective surface and saw not just her reflection, but resilience staring back. She stepped forward onto the sidewalk, and she smiled. Because justice, though delayed, had arrived. Because truth, though buried, had risen. And because belief in goodness, no matter how naive it once seemed, had proven stronger than fear. The sign remained straight. The path ahead, finally, was clear. This story reminds us that integrity often begins with small choices. A simple act like straightening a sign may seem insignificant, yet it reveals character. In daily life, we are constantly given moments like that. Moments when we can ignore what is wrong or quietly correct it. The world does not always reward honesty immediately. Sometimes the honest are questioned, doubted, or even blamed. But truth has a way of surfacing when courage and conscience work together. We also learn that silence can protect injustice. Many people saw the warning signs but chose comfort over responsibility. In our workplaces, schools, and communities, we must ask ourselves whether we are observers or participants in fairness. Justice is not only the job of courts. It begins with individuals who are willing to speak when something feels wrong. This story also challenges prejudice. It shows how quickly assumptions can be made based on position, race, or status. In everyday life, let us treat people with dignity before judgment. Let us examine our words, our posts, our silence. Accountability is not only for others, it is for ourselves. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Tell us in the comments what lesson stood out to you and where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss stories that remind us to stand for truth. May God bless everyone watching today. And if you believe that justice may be delayed but goodness always wins in the end, comment Amen.